Hey guys, it's Mad Friday and welcome back. Right, as promised, here is my Tankfest report for you guys from the Tankfest 2015 at the Bovington Tank Museum. Right, don't worry, I'm not going to talk for the whole thing. I just got a few photos while I chat some rubbish, and then on to almost an hour of arena footage for you. Pretty much the whole of the afternoon's activities in the arena I recorded, and I've put it together in a little montage for you guys. Right, so Tankfest 2015, was it any good? Well, yeah, it was pretty good, to be honest. Started off the day, as you can see in the pictures, looking around the restoration workshops, which you couldn't get in normally unless you remember the Tank Museum. Then I had a quick look around the Tank Museum, tried to do some of the wargaming stuff but couldn't, but I'll talk about that in the prizes that I picked up from Tank Museum. I'll be putting out a video with a competition to win some bits and bobs I picked up from my day there for you guys. Right, but look forward to that coming in very soon, probably tomorrow. So what you need to do is pay attention to the video footage, because I'll just be asking a question about one of the tanks in the video footage and you can win some nice prizes. But for anybody else who's just clicked on this video just to see the footage, welcome to the channel. Please subscribe if you like. I'll be doing more stuff like this in the future. Yeah, so right. In a second though, I'm going to show you my favourite trade stand from the day. These things were absolutely brilliant. I wish I could win the lottery. They were amazing. I can't believe the level of detail and just how perfect they were. Here they are coming up right now. These things were epic, made by a company called Armortech, perfect in every detail. Even the metal thicknesses are correct to scale, and they were just amazing to watch, and they even looked and sounded like the real thing. And I'll stop talking right now. After this is coming up the arena footage, so please enjoy. It's quite long. I've tried to give you as much footage as I can from my aspect, watching from the bank outside the Tankfest. So enjoy. Towing a gun. Oh, the King Tiger's coming down there. Yeah.
It'd be ideal for that stealthy reconnaissance. Independent suspension, it was a very sophisticated vehicle, but there just wasn't enough of them, hence the desire to build vehicles like the Morris armoured car. And the Morris armoured car in the front there actually saw service a huge number of places, and for an improvised vehicle actually went on throughout the whole of the war.
The Morris is actually powered by a 4-cylinder Morris engine. It's literally a motor car put together back to front with the arm. They are horribly uncomfortable things to drive. The driver sits centrally in the middle of the vehicle, and he's sitting virtually on the floor. So his legs are sticking out dead straight in front of him to the pedals. And that makes them a monstrosity to drive. They've actually had to go at driving. It's chronically uncomfortable. The Mark I, the original version, which you've also got in the museum, was a 4x2. It had no driven front axle at all. But they produced vast numbers of them, as David said, as an emergency vehicle after the fall of France and after we were on our own. We take a crew of 3, you'd have a Bren gun in the right-hand turret, a boy's anti-tank rifle in that sort of flap on the left, and a radio set, but they were not really ideal fighting vehicles, they were done in a bit of a hurry. The Dingo...
Not that many were made, but it's one of a number that saw service, and they were used down on HMS Fearless, HMS Intrepid, on the beach landing craft, and saw service in the Falklands War, of course. Again, for that very important role of making sure flat-bottom landing craft they can get back out to sea and pick up their next load.
In theory, the bath could go in as deep as the top of the hull, but that didn't because the driver was well underwater. One member of the crew was trained as a diver, so he could go down with breathing apparatus on and attach lines to vehicles they were dragging out. One of the strange things is that the bar has been replaced in service by a similar vehicle, but based on the German Leopard, and it's about the only instance I know of what is the effect of Panzer serving with the British Army. Just don't let the newspapers hear that, that's all, they get totally upset. And that's why this particular vehicle carries a lifeboat, because it's really is the pusher bar on the front, which is usually made up of hands and ropes. It's made fairly soft when it pushes against another vehicle, or a vessel, for instance. The next century we'll show you is actually, although it looks like a conventional Bovington, it's the last of the Centurion Avries, armoured vehicle Royal Engineers. Now the original Avry had a 165mm demolition gun. When they ran out of ammunition for that and blew a couple of them up in the Gulf, the next ones were started out as OP tanks for the Royal Artillery. They were a sort of mobile observation post. They were then translated into Avries like the one you see here. But from our point of view, it's showing itself off as a standard gun tank. Normally, the Centurion as a gun tank had a crew of 4. That's a driver and 3 men in the turret. It's powered by the Rolls-Royce engines at the back, driving through a merry-go-round gearbox to the rear drive sprocket.
One thing that happens here at the museum, we often have people come along and they say, oh, yeah, I served in that vehicle. And we sometimes get a bit cynical because you have so many people say they served in that vehicle. But then you only have to look at this one particular Centurion to realise an awful lot of men who served in the army could well have served on this particular Centurion. We know it was built by British Leyland. It went into service on the 12th of August 1955. It was in BAOR, that's the British Army of the Rhine, in March 1968. It went into a reserve there at one point in a depot. It went off to an armoured delivery squadron in March of 1968. Then it was issued to the Royal Horse Artillery in 1976. Served with the 40th Field Regiment Royal Artillery, so it was an artillery observation Centurion in 77. Came to command workshops over refitting in 1980 and was converted by Pearson's Engineering in 1981 to fit the plough on the front, which we removed but was used therefore in that Avry role. And it was used by Vickers Defence Systems in the early 1980s, before it was actually handed over finally to the museum in 1998. So an awful lot of soldiers from quite a number of different units would have probably spent their time in that Centurion in its lifespan. Something that was designed at Chobham, just off the M3, back in the 60s, by a British team. And they were putting together, they were trying to work out what's the best way of defeating incoming projectiles. And one of the things they came up with was a laminate that included ceramics. Even to this day, the proper formulation for Chobham armour is still kept as top secret, but it's a layering system, and it has, for its weight and its size, a much better stopping potential than just straightforward steel. And they fitted it for the first time on a British tank, on a British production tank at Challenger 1. And it's one of the reasons why tanks look, modern tanks, like they do, with this rather flat, faceted surfaces, because you can't actually bend Chobham armour. It's an armour that needs to be put together in flat packs, so when you look at our Challenger 1 driving around, you're actually looking at a skin on the outside. That's a metal skin, and underneath that skin, that's where the secret Chobham armour is.
The other thing to look at with the Challenger is the reserve fuel tanks hanging on the back. As David said earlier, a modern tank gets nearly more than but it had a number of real innovations. The first one was that the driver is on a sort of sun lounger arrangement, almost a reclining seat. So when the hatch is shut above him, he lies on his back, changes gear with his feet, the other thing was, they increased the size of the gun to 120mm, and in doing so, because it's such a big gun, they come up with the idea of firing a projectile and having a shell case that was disposable. In other words, it's self-consuming. When you fired the gun, the shell case went to it blew up completely. It was beautiful. The other problem with it was the engine. Powered by a Leyland L60, it's a 12-piston, 12-cylinder, I should say, vertical opposed engine. It was what they call multi-fuel. It was supposed to run on anything from petrol and peanut butter, but they were basically used as diesel. And for a long time it was the Achilles heel of Chieftain. And they were always breaking down. They're not so bad now. But it means it's a very unusual tank, a very impressive tank.
Chieftain, another one of those tanks, it was still the generation mainly of steel armour, so very, very thick steel on the front. Tremendously well-angled glacé plates, as they call it, that front bit by the driver. But later in its service life, as the Soviet tanks and anti-tank weaponry got bigger, more armour was added. So if you look on the front of this particular Chieftain, which is a late model, it's got what they call still brew armour added either side of the main gun.
Everyone's going to school now. And the
in the military, they have red diesel like farm vehicles, but they have
certainly
normal
some
coloured
early
diesel.
ones of those.
I don't know.
I don't know what I said. I think it said a red smoke screen though.
The next tank that's actually come on while I've been talking is the A34 Comet.
Yeah.
They were built by Leyland Motors and really not entered service until the very end of the war. But it was a tank which in its own right could take on a Tiger with a fair chance of knocking it out. That is, if it got the first shot in, if it got the second shot in, it hadn't. And the Comet is powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, basically the same engine that was in the Spitfire that was flying over us this morning. And but it's de-supercharged for use in the tank. It's got a version of Christie suspension, that is with springs bolted to the outside of the tank. It's about the last tank of any kind of Christie suspension. After that, they really got too heavy takes a 5-man crew. It's 3 men in the turret and 2 in the front of the hull, and it's armed with a 77mm gun, which was itself a cut-down version of the old 17-pounder. Quite an effective all-round deal. It's really too late to see much more service, and after the war, rapidly eclipsed by the Centurion, which is even better.
The Comet's got a fantastic engine though, that Meteor engine. You may be able to see on the rear, there's 2 little fishtail exhausts, but basically there's no silencer at all. And so you get that lovely rumble of the big petrol Meteor as it goes around. In the first Gulf War.
And the next tank that's come on is a tank you will have seen before. It's the Leopard. And as we said earlier, the Leopard is seen almost universal use. I've talked to 1 or 2 British tank crews who say that they don't particularly like it because they say it's too roomy in the turret and you're liable to get thrown about all over the place. But it's very fast. Powered by an MTU 10-cylinder engine, so it gives it a good turn of speed, and it's fitted with torsion buttons. The other thing you'll notice about the German tank is it has 7 road wheels. Most of the ones you've seen up till now, the American and British ones, have 6. And 7 road wheels is the optimum number. Trust the Germans to get that right as well. But generally speaking, Leopard is regarded as maybe a bit under-armoured compared with those that we use, and a little bit underdone.
With the Leopard tank, this particular version that's driving around was given to us by the German Army. You saw 2 others driving around earlier that were given to us by the Canadian Defence Forces. The Canadians famously decided they didn't want tanks anymore, took them out of service, then went off to Afghanistan, realised they dropped a big one, and actually had to go back to the Germans and buy more Leopards.
And now the other way, just to make a change, is the M3 or M3A1. It's a tank that we called the General Stewart, after the Confederate General James Stewart. The Americans knew it as the light tank M3, but they adopted the names we picked up to it as well. It was actually, when it first went out to join the British Army in the desert, it was deemed to be a cruiser tank. It had the same armament as the British cruiser, but it was really more of a reconnaissance vehicle, quite fast. It ran a lot without the turrets in the end. They were probably better as a Leopard maybe without the turret on it. Because the 37mm gun was not really rapidly outclassed, it got that effect. Powered by a 7-cylinder Wright radial aircraft engine in the back. That's an air-cooled engine upright in the back of the tank. And like most American tanks in those days, it drives to a forward gearbox and then into front-mounted drive sprockets, which is something you won't find on any British tank except our very light tanks. 7 Royal Tank Regiment, and with the mainstay, the fighting force of Atlas, which the Germans back briefly before they charged on and won the whole campaign. They're hideous little tanks, to be honest, and probably better as a mobile machine gun post than a tank, but they were used as tanks. We only used them the once. We lost most of them in France, and I think we're probably quite happy to do so, because we couldn't really use them for anything else. Quite interesting vehicles.
The Matilda is the Matilda 1's really the first what we would call an infantry tank. It was designed very specifically to help the infantry forward across what was thought of going to be like a First World War battlefield. They called it the shelled area. So it had thick armour, so it could withstand blasts from shells, machine gun to help suppress the enemy position and let the infantry get onto the target. That was the idea behind it. It was in response to a War Office requirement in 1935 when designed by Sir John Carden of Vickers. and it cost him £15,000 to design the tank, and each one that was produced afterwards was £5,000 each.
And horizontal torsion bar suspension. Very impressive vehicle indeed in many ways. Usually with a separate component for the driver, which had its own machine underneath, and enabled him to sweep the battlefield independently. You probably won't hear us very well while the engine of that thing is roaring, but it's an impressive sound and well worth soaking up in its own right.
The M60s, following on really a whole series of American tanks, the pattern tanks as we called them after the Second World War, in a sense the Americans just upgraded and built larger versions of their own original designs. So the M48 tank came into service just after World War II. The M60, they started upgrading it, they started designing it in the 50s. It does go into service actually in 1960, and again, you may recognise this because of course a lot of countries have got it all around the world. It was sold on to 15,000 made, so there's an awful lot of them, and they were sold on and passed on by the US government, and at the moment there's M60s all along the border of Turkey, keeping an eye on the Syrian border there, so still appear on the news a lot.
I think the secret was it was a very serviceable tank, which is why it's still used in such large numbers. Very reliable and quite tough. Now the next vehicle there is something really quite unusual for the tank museum. It's an M110. It's a self-propelled gun. It's on a special 25-ton low-profile chassis with the whole gun and the gun mounting set above it. So it's unlike the usual self-propelled gun, you have a superstructure. This has none at all. It's got an earth anchor at the back which is hinged and folds down to dig into the ground when the gun fires to stop it leaping backwards, powered by a continental engine at the front, and the driver sitting below the engine deck alongside it, and with large diameter road wheels. Again, it's sprung on torsion bar suspension.
This gun that's on the top there, an 8-inch gun, that could, or roughly about 203mm. This particular version, they put a muzzle brake on the end. If you look on the end of the barrel, that's to help dissipate some of the force and lessen the recoil. But on a full charge, that gun could fire around from here to about 30 kilometres away. So quite a sizable gun there, as you can see. Self-propelled artillery, not really part of our sort of collecting policy here, but it's good to see it because it's an example of what's not a tank really. It's a chassis that's used to move an artillery piece around the battlefield. One version of this in British Army service actually was tested to fire nuclear shells on the European battlefield, so that could fire potentially a nuclear shell in a tactical situation. The other vehicle, by the way, that would go around, you've seen earlier, our ride vehicle that was taking people for rides, that would be the vehicle that would accompany the N110, carrying all the ammunition for it into battle.
Right, now we've got, this is really something of a treat for you. It's an M103, one of the biggest of the American tanks, but very similar to the British Conqueror. Carried the same gun, although being American, built on a scaled-up version of the M60 chassis with a continental diesel engine, automatic transmission, really made it much more mobile. And it's got a 120mm gun, which is why it's in such an enlarged turret. This version, which is the M103A1E1, they were used by the United States Marine Corps. The Army decided they were too big for them, didn't want them, and gave them away. So the Marines gladly took them. They're what use they are for amphibious operations these days. You can well ask yourself. It's a huge turret, and the people inside it usually get lost if they're not careful. The commander's so far at the back he's out of touch with everybody, but that gun is an amazing size in there, and with a hitting power of 120mm, which is really no more than Chieftain and Challenger carry today, but in those days it was fired separately. shell and brass case ammunition. So it had to be loaded by either 2 people or 1 person working one thing at a time, the projectile and then the case, and then firing them and disposing of the case, which was a problem in itself.
Just the idea behind the M103 and the British Conqueror tanks, they thought we need a super heavy tank that would act in what would now be called an overwatch position. Our normal tanks, the Centurions, the M48s, the M60s would be in the foreground. These whoppers would be behind, hopefully picking off Soviet tanks before they got in range. That was the idea. But with the Conqueror, we replaced with the Centurion and then the Chieftain, and with the M103, they just didn't really like the idea of the US Army after a certain time, so they went for the Universal or the main battle tank instead. And it was also a hugely expensive tank. Back in 1954, one of these M103 tanks, because they were so big and complex, cost even back then $300,000, and that was a lot of money then. So not that many were built, and the Army passed them on to the US Marines, as David said, quite quickly. But they came out of Leningrad. You can see our Panzer III coming on. This was a vehicle, again, captured in North Africa. We know a fair bit about this Panzer III. It was taken to the UK, evaluated, lots of reports written on it. And some years ago, the guys in the workshops had a refurb on it. It was always kept in running order. You may see some photographs in older books. Sometimes it was painted, as sadly some of our vehicles still are actually, in rather erroneous colours. But this has now been put back to the colour scheme it was when it was in service in North Africa. It's what they call a Tropen vehicle, TP, was stamped on the manufacturing plate, and that meant it had been adapted specifically for use in North Africa in dusty conditions. They changed the air filters on the back. Good example of Panzer III of German tank design. They went through many years of trying to get their tank design right after Hitler came to power in '33. And the Panzer III, Panzer IV were the tanks that they aimed to go to war with. Panzer I, Panzer II were really the German training tanks. Panzer III starts the war with a low velocity 30mm gun. This particular model, the L, has got a much more powerful, higher velocity 50mm gun. Again, beautifully engineered, it's very finely made, very quiet engine. If I stop waffling for a moment, you'll probably hear how quiet it is. And this particular vehicle has some battle damage on it still, and is in a remarkably original condition.
Well, if you could hear it, it's got a Maybach V12 engine in the back. I should stress, by the way, that all German tanks, almost all German tanks anyway, had petrol engines. They didn't have diesels. And the Maybach V12 in the back of the Panzer III is a petrol engine. Again, like most American tanks, it drives through a front-mounting gearbox to a front drive sprocket and has torsion bar suspension running all the way along. That's quite typical of the German tanks. All of welded construction, usually with side doors in the turret, which was regarded as a weak spot, really, if you could hit one at all. But it's those characteristics that make it outstanding.
In the 60s, this is the T-72 tank, and this, one might argue, is probably the most numerous tank in service around the world at the moment, and it has seen a lot of combat action, and it is a superbly effective, in simple design.
This particular T-72 is from the Polish army. It was gifted to us as an exchange. It's got the spaced armour on the sides, which opens out to deflect incoming shot. But the thing is powered by the same sort of diesel engine again. The Russians actually started out with a tank called the T-64, which featured a sort of horizontally opposed diesel engine, which was rather based on what we were doing with Chieftain. It was nearly as awful as Chieftain as well, and the T-64 never left the Red Army. T-72, which has got more of the traditional engine gearbox, was used by a number of countries as as David said, all around the world, and it still is. It's got torsion bar suspension again, and it's got an auto loader in the base of the turret, so that you can lower the whole tank. You don't need the loaders. The only man in most tanks who works standing up. It's about the only way he can do it. But by doing away with the loader, you do away with the extra height of the standing man. The drawback is that the loading device is like a carousel arrangement from the base of the turret, and if that is hit, the tank goes up like a bomb. Again, it doesn't matter to the Russians, they've got so many of them, but it could really blow the turret off quite easily, killing the crew straight away.
There's many variants of the T-72, and the Russian army made sure they kept the very best versions for their own forces, different standards of armour protection, different weapon systems and different types of ammunition were issued depending on the country. And we've actually found that you can buy a working T-72. We found them for sale as little as 30,000 euros, which is peanuts in military terms. So it's a tank that was made in such numbers, and with the end of the Cold War they've been passed on, they've been sold around the world, so these will be being seen in combat for decades to come. And of course, with so many armoured vehicles now, you can buy upgrade packages, so what was originally a fairly basic vehicle can have new armour, new sighting systems, new weapons added to it, so it becomes a very potent system. And you may have noticed there,
been around a while before that, the tank has a version of Christie suspension, meaning that each row wheel's independently sprung on coil springs, but with large flat plate tracks to deal with the snow. It's powered by a V12 diesel engine in the back and proved to be quite reliable. It was built in huge numbers because, as David said earlier, Russians regarded tanks as expendable and available in huge numbers for that reason. It is actually, if you go up close, pretty crudely made as well. But that never worried the Russians. They weren't trying to win prizes for beauty. They wanted loads of fighting machines. That was the best way of doing it.
one of the things is often pointed out is that crudity of Russian vehicles, but famously when a T-34 was captured outside Moscow, taken to Berlin, and Albert Speer, the German armaments minister, got all the German tank designers to look closely at the T-34. Initially they were hugely scathing because it seemed so crudely engineered, but there was a time when the Russians actually drew up plans to, or the Germans actually drew up plans to copy the T-34 because they realised it had such good qualities, such as the sloped armour, good wide tracks, ideal on the Russian front where you've got mud, snow, very few metal roads. But in the end, being Germans, they thought they could go one better, and they end up building the Panther tank as rear response. Don't forget, often a myth, it wasn't the T-34 that led to the Tiger being built. That amazingly was that because the Tiger bumped into, or sorry, not the Tiger, but the Germans bumped into the British Matilda tanks in France in 1940 with that thick armour we just saw in the earlier Matilda. That caused Hitler to initiate the Tiger programme, not actually this whopping great Russian tank, the T-34. Germans were very...
Turret number 101, it was captured in Tunisia in the battle with Churchill's 48 RTR, and we've restored it, we've had it restored to running order. It's quite an impressive sight to see a Tiger going. But that's the real thing, that's the tank that probably terrified more British and American tank troops than anything else. The idea of running into one of those was something they didn't relish at all. Again, it's powered by a Maybach V12 engine, and it was done really because they wished to standardise on something. It was against the wishes of Hitler. Hitler wanted them all to have diesel engines and decided that's what they laid down a decree, that's what they were going to have. But no one took the blindest bit of notice of it. It's fitted with extra wide tracks to deal with soft conditions, but those tracks were so wide that if you moved the tank by rail, You had to take those tracks off, take off the outer set of road wheels, put on special narrow tracks for it to be able to sit on a railway wagon at all. It has torsion bar suspension, and the road wheels actually overlap and interleave with one another, so that they cover as much ground as possible.
As you're probably aware, Tiger 131, it was captured in Tunisia, brought back to the UK, evaluated, lots of reports written on it, and it came to the Tank Museum in 1951. And we started a programme back at the end of the 90s with help from the lottery, from Prison Fund, individuals, companies. They helped us get this back into running order, which wasn't easy, because as part of the evaluation, the tank was taken apart at least twice, we think, and the original Maybach HL210 engine, which we still have in the museum, was sectioned as a teaching aid. So we actually had to use a HL230 engine that we had a spare, and that's what was refurbished over time. Many ups and downs in that process, but at the moment, after a number of years, we've still got the only working Tiger one in the world. There's 6 real Tigers left. A 7th has just been put together out of bits and is now in the German Tank Museum in Münster. It's privately owned, it's on loan there. So it's a bit of a rare beast. 1,300 Tiger 1s were made during the war, but of course an awful lot of them, as we were making the point earlier about tanks, they symbolise things as well. And for the French, having a Tiger left on your territory, they were quite rapidly collected together and chopped up for scrap. And there is one remaining by the roadside in the Moutier in France. It's now a memorial. There's a Tiger at the French Tank Museum. There's 2 in Russia, one at their museum at Kablinka, and one as well in somewhere called the Victory Park, which is in a bit of a wreck. And there's one Tiger even earlier in production than this one that was in Germany and the UK for some time, and it's now back in America. And the Americans are just beginning a restoration program. But this one, it's a rare opportunity here, obviously, seeing the Tiger. At that time, they were both very friendly, and the Chinese copied the Russian T-54 tank, and they call their tanks Type tank. So this is a Type 59 tank, which is therefore basically a Chinese copy of a Russian T-54 tank. I hope you're paying attention out there, because there is going to be a test later, so make note. So Type 59, and this particular tank is even slightly weirder. It's got a British gun on it. What happened was that so many of these vehicles were sold around the world. The British Army, or the Royal Ordnance, actually offered the L7-105 gun to countries that would like to change the gun that was originally fitted, a 100mm gun, to the 105mm L7 gun. We've seen that gun already on a number of vehicles. We'll see it in a moment on our Centurion tanks. And it was offered. It wasn't taken up as a sales project. It didn't really work that well in terms of countries not particularly buying it, because they had no call to particularly. But this is the testbed vehicle that was used by Royal Ordnance, taken to some of the defence shows, and when they'd finished with it some years ago, it was gifted to the Tank Museum.
The Type 59 is powered by a V12 diesel. It's unusual in that it's crossways mounted at the back, but that was exactly as it was in the Russian tanks that the Type 59 was copied from. The other feature, of course, is that it has torsion bar suspension. They're quite large road wheels, but they run right across the floor of the tank. The V-tank springs on the outside at all the suspension is taken care of by twisting rods underneath the floor. That's what you've got on the Type 59. It's powered by General Motors diesel in the back. This is a later version with the larger 57mm gun. And normally they had a 2-man turret and a very uncomfortable 1-man driver's position. But they were remarkable tanks. They went on for years. We supplied them to the Russians. A number were built in Canada. And they They were supplied to New Zealand and other armies, and been quite popular there. But they tend to get outclassed later on. Without the ground clearance that they needed to give them a good cross-country performance, which their later cousins did. Not better. But it's a nice low profile tank, and was probably the most reliable of all the British tanks of the Second World War.
With hull vehicles. Later in the war they put a bigger gun on, such as the 76mm gun that's on this particular variant of Sherman, and they up-armour them, and they make just under 50,000 of them. And for the American war plan, it worked. They threw their engineering ability and money at the problem when the war came along, and don't forget they were on the winning side. Now this particular Sherman going around, this is the Tank Museum Sherman, and this is the one that was used recently as the Fury in the war movie The Fury. And we've left all the kit on it, so it looks like it's kitted out as it was in the film.
It's worth pointing out actually that the Sherman in question, it's a 76mm gun Sherman with a long gun in it and the enlarged turret, but it's actually powered by a pair of General Motors diesels. Now the US Army during the Second World War would have nothing to do with diesel engines at all. They decided on petrol it would be. So the diesel engines were only used by the US Marine Corps in the Pacific. So in that, to that sense, it's actually the wrong tank for the film, but it was all that was available. And I think the film was about the crew and their survival in the tank more than anything else. And that really showed up well. Brad Pitt was the star. So that's going around now. You'll also notice it has a slightly different suspension.
I know.
They had a version of the 438. The worst of them is always said to be the version of the M4A4, which has what they call a multi-bank Chrysler engine. Actually 5 6-cylinder Chrysler engines, all clustered down the central drive junction, central pancreas, and that engine, for some reason, the British liked. It's the most awful thing you can possibly imagine. Had to be taken out and lift the whole engine out just to change the plugs. But we liked it. We got them all for that reason, not seen that done anything. It's a slightly longer tank than the others. You haven't got an M4A4 here today.
This particular Sherman, it was actually the history is privately owned. It's been researched. It went to North Africa, built originally in 1942. Went to North Africa, served with British troops. Then came back to the UK, and amazingly, it was converted into a bar, one of those beach armoured recovery vehicles we talked about earlier for D-Day. It's another one of the tanks that was then subsequently used in the Fury movie. This one you'll see is Lucy Sue, written on the side. It was one of the tanks knocked out by the Tiger in the film.
Now coming down behind that Sherman is yet another Sherman. This is the version with the cast hull. They were built by the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, and they were quite distinctive in shape. They're powered by a 9-cylinder radial engine, a 9-cylinder, and again driving through the gearbox at the front. But they're still with the same 75mm gun, the same turret, the same suspension. So although they are distinctive from the Sherman, quite an effective machine in its own way. They were used extensively by all armies, and did very well. You'll notice that typically it's got a 50 caliber Brown machine gun up on top of the turret. These were meant for the commander. The British tended not to like them. The idea was to have a machine gun on top of the turret to shoot down attacking aeroplanes. The British thought the most sensible thing to do when an aeroplane was attacking you was to shut the lid and hide inside and wait till it went away, which it usually did. But the Americans liked to shoot back, so they had a 50 cal stuck on top of the turret to try and knock down aircraft. To anything else. They have the driver's on the left, of course. He has a down gunner sitting to his right who worked the radio in American tanks, and also operated what was called the narrated gun, which is a 30 caliber Browning in the front of the hull. Although it's generally reckoned to be an American recognition, and it was. And by the time of D-Day, it became universal to British and American tanks. You can see British tanks with white stars painted on them as well. And it became the sort of semi-official Allied recognition sign. So when you see a white star, don't automatically assume it represents an American tank. It can be a tank in British service with the star painted on it just the same.
And this particular Sherman, the last one now leaving the arena, this one was actually came from the Belgian army or Belgian stocks after the war, and the current owner restored it almost to, as you can see, almost as is described, factory fresh condition. Again, it's appeared in the Fury movie, and so far, I always don't want to tempt fate, but he's actually had very reliable driving. He went on a whole 150-mile trip in this particular Sherman up through Holland on retracing the 30 Corps route, liberating Nijmegen, Arnhem, etc. So 150 miles of trouble-free driving, which is another thing to remember about the Sherman tanks. They were on the whole fantastically reliable, and of course also the other great thing about them, replacing parts, working on them was so much easier than some of the other vehicles of the time. Now what we're going to be doing is getting those vehicles into position, because we'll be seeing them a little bit later on in our battle scenario, so they'll be moving off in a slightly different way to most of the other vehicles we saw earlier.
As it is to me, it is a Hurricane from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. It's supposed to be an indicator, but here he is, giving his display in front of us here. A cannon-equipped Hurricane, ladies and gentlemen. As a prelude to our reenactment here this afternoon of Fury. Let's enjoy the spectacle and the unusual day, a Spitfire and a Hurricane on the same day here at the Tankfest 2015. See a US armoured force preparing to take up an overwatch position in preparation for an assault on a defended position. The US force has now called for an airstrike to reduce the German defenders' morale and fighting effectiveness, lowering their ability to resist the coming attack.
God, that made me jump.
Dazed and confused, the surviving German defenders reoccupy their firing positions, clearing debris from fire lanes in anticipation of the coming US assault. US armour, supported by infantry, is following up the airstrike with a quick attack against the German positions in order to maximise the shock effect on the defenders. From the beaches of Normandy to the bombed-out cities of the Third Reich, Allied forces had raced through Germany, occupying her towns and cities and famously meeting their Soviet allies at the River Elbe. The long-feared German redoubt had failed to materialize, and Hitler was finally dead.